Chapter 15. Echoes of Water. Lessons for today. Long after the Khmer Empire receded into legend, the reservoirs remained. The West Baray, vast as a city, still holds water during the rains. The moats around Angkor Wat continue to mirror the towers as they have for centuries. Even the silted canals that once carried life across the plains remain etched into the land. Reminders that the Khmer vision of civilization was inseparable from water. Modern scholars have come to see these reservoirs and canals not only as feats of engineering, but as windows into a way of thinking that combined pragmatism, artistry, and spirituality. To the Khmer, managing water was never merely a matter of survival. It was an act of devotion, a statement of identity, and a means of forging a connection between humanity and the cosmos. This perspective challenges modern assumptions, but the concept has been seen and known on the globe for indigenous. In many societies, technology is separated from ritual. Infrastructure is thought of as purely utilitarian, but in Angkor, every embankment and spillway was imbued with meaning. Each layer of earth, laid down to contain a reservoir, also carried offerings to nagas and deities, tokens of respect for the powers that made water abundant and life possible. The lessons of this integrated vision are especially relevant today. As climate change disrupts familiar patterns of rain and drought across the globe, the Khmer experience reminds us that no hydraulic system, however sophisticated, is immune to nature's variability. The same reservoirs that brought prosperity for centuries ultimately became vulnerable to the combined pressures of environmental change, population growth, and political fragmentation. Yet the decline of Angkor was not a simple story of failure. Archaeological evidence shows that Khmer communities adapted in remarkable ways. They shifted settlement patterns, diversified their crops, and continued to maintain portions of the hydraulic network long after imperial authority had faded. This resilience underscores an important truth. When large systems falter, it is often local knowledge and small-scale adaptation that sustain communities. Standing today at the edge of the West Baray, one can still see fishermen casting nets, just as their ancestors did. Children splash in the shallows, unaware they are playing in the work of an ancient civilization. These quiet scenes are proof that the Khmer legacy was never only about monumental temples or royal power. It was about a way of life that understood the gift and peril of water. International efforts to conserve Angkor have brought renewed attention to this heritage. Archaeologists use satellite imagery to trace lost canals and model how water once flowed across the landscape. Engineers study ancient spillways to glean insights into sustainable irrigation, and historians pore over inscriptions that, in their poetic language, reveal the hopes and anxieties of a people who saw themselves as stewards of the world's fertility. Perhaps the greatest lesson is that infrastructure alone is never enough. The Khmer built reservoirs the size of cities, but it was their shared sense of purpose, the conviction that water was sacred, that bound them to the task of maintaining these colossal systems. When unity frayed and ritual lost its power to inspire collective action, even the most ingenious designs could not sustain prosperity. Yet it is also true that the Khmer did something extraordinary. They demonstrated how human ambition and natural forces can be woven together into a landscape of enduring beauty and utility. The barays, canals, and moats of Angkor are testaments to the possibility of a civilization that aspires not only to dominate nature, but to mirror its cycles and respect its power. In this story, there is caution. There is also inspiration. The caution lies in the recognition that every triumph carries the seeds of vulnerability. The inspiration comes from seeing how the Khmer, with limited tools and immense vision, created a system that nourished millions and shaped the imagination of Southeast Asia for centuries. Even today, as the morning sun climbs over Angkor Wat and the air thickens with the promise of rain, the reservoirs glimmer in the dawn. They remind us that water, more than any monument or inscription, is the true foundation of civilization. To understand why the Khmer built reservoirs the size of cities is to understand the depth of their respect for life's most essential element, and the enduring human desire to bring order, meaning, and beauty to the forces that sustain us. Thank you for spending time with us on this journey through the waterways of the Khmer Empire. From vast barays to sacred canals, we've explored how water shaped not only agriculture and architecture, but belief, diplomacy, and daily life. These reservoirs were more than storage. They were mirrors of the sky, symbols of harmony, and lifelines of a civilization. As we reflect on their legacy, may we carry forward the wisdom that water is not just a resource, but a relationship, one that calls for care, reverence, and resilience. We hope this story has brought you both insight and calm. Until next time, sleep well and dream of ancient waters. The Khmer Empire built reservoirs the size of cities. How a civilization rose, flourished, and left behind the silent marvels that still puzzle us today. Let us begin our journey into the watery heart of Angkor. Why the Khmer Empire built reservoirs the size of cities. Chapter 1. A Kingdom Shaped by Rain. Long before European travelers carried home tales of Angkor's towering temples, the Khmer Empire had already harnessed the rhythms of Southeast Asia's monsoon rains. From the 9th century onward, this civilization expanded across the floodplains of what is now Cambodia, building one of the largest pre-industrial cities the world has ever known. Unlike many empires founded on conquest alone, the Khmer owed much of their success to water. How it was collected, stored, and guided across miles of flat land. The seasonal monsoon dictated every harvest. For half the year, rains could flood fields and carve channels through settlements. For the other half, drought could parch the soil until crops withered. Between these extremes, the Khmer discovered a truth that would shape their destiny. Whoever could master the water could master the land itself. At the center of this mastery were the massive barais, artificial reservoirs so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. The largest, the West Barai, stretched nearly 5 miles long and over a mile wide. Though it might look like a natural lake, its perfectly rectangular embankments told another story. Thousands of laborers spent decades digging, lining the walls with laterite blocks and clay, shaping an enormous basin that could catch and hold monsoon waters for months at a time. Historians believe the West Baray alone could have irrigated tens of thousands of acres, sustaining rice paddies even in the driest months. But beyond practical function, these reservoirs carried powerful symbolism. In Khmer cosmology, water was more than a resource, it was a divine element. A king who controlled water was a king with a mandate from the gods. This combination of spiritual and material purpose drove the construction of each successive reservoir. Smaller moats and canals laced every temple complex, ensuring that no corner of Angkor lay far from water's life-giving touch. The intricate network made the city resilient to droughts that devastated less organized neighbors. At its height, Angkor supported up to 1 million people, a metropolis that depended on this hidden infrastructure as much as its monuments of stone. Yet building such reservoirs was no simple feat. Workers faced seasons of punishing heat and sudden floods. Excavation was done with simple tools, wooden shovels, baskets, and poles. To raise the dikes, laborers carried soil by hand or balanced wicker containers across their shoulders. Over years, these efforts accumulated into embankments tall enough to hold back millions of cubic meters of water. At first glance, it may seem impossible that a pre-modern society achieved such scale without scale or mechanized machines. But the Khmer organized labor through corvée, obligatory service that each household owed to the king. Teams of villagers rotated through projects in steady shifts, sometimes for months at a time. Though the work was grueling, it bound communities together under the promise that their toil served not just the ruler, but the common good. The earliest barais, like Indratataka, rose under King Yasovarman I around the end of the 9th century. Each new king added to this system, enlarging and refining it. Over generations, reservoirs were linked to canals and spillways that directed water precisely where it was needed. sometimes across many miles. By the time the West Baray was completed in the 11th century, Angkor had become an engineered oasis amid the seasonal extremes. For modern archaeologists, these reservoirs reveal as much about Khmer society as the temples themselves. They hint at a culture that understood water as both a spiritual and political instrument, a people who saw no contradiction between worship and technology. Every block laid in the dikes was an offering to the gods as much as an act of survival. Even today, the outlines of the West Baray remain visible from the air, massive, straight, and unmistakable. If you stand on its banks as the sun sets, you can almost imagine the scene centuries ago. The golden glow on rippling water, the silhouettes of workers with baskets on their shoulders, and in the distance, the towers of Angkor Wat rising like lotus buds from the plain. In the chapters to come, we will follow how this vast hydraulic network evolved, how it fed and sustained an empire, and how, in time, it contributed to the Khmer civilization's decline. But in this first chapter, we see the beginnings, when water was the promise of life, and ambition stretched as far as the horizon itself. Capital Hariharalaya stood on the plains near the northern shore of the Tonle Sap. For generations, farmers here had relied on seasonal floods to nourish their rice paddies. Yet the monsoon was fickle. When rains failed, so did harvests. Indravarman saw that true security required a reservoir vast enough to carry the kingdom through even the harshest drought. This idea would become the Indratataka Baray, the first great artificial lake of the Khmer Empire. The first great artificial lake of the Khmer Empire. The Indrataka was not a mere pond dug by village laborers. Its scale was monumental, roughly 3.8 kilometers long and 800 meters wide. Engineers had to measure the land with careful precision, designing embankments to hold millions of cubic meters of water. Channels were dug to feed the basin during rainy seasons. Sluice gates were installed to release water when fields grew thirsty. And, in Helsing, people had to make immense amounts of water for filtering. He so often pointedly inferred he was enjoying the Fillmore, that people felt grateful and flushed, thirsty. The entire project represented a profound coordination of labor, knowledge, and royal authority. To the Khmers, such undertakings were not simply civil engineering feats, they were statements of cosmic order. The reservoir's rectangular shape aligned perfectly with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. This alignment echoed Hindu cosmology, in which the universe was a mandala of concentric forms centered around Mount Meru. By constructing the Baray as a microcosm of the universe, Indravarman proclaimed himself the earthly link to divine order. He was not just a king, he was a custodian of cosmic harmony. Construction of the Indratataka required thousands of workers. Entire villages contributed labor, some digging earth with iron hoes, others carrying soil away in woven baskets. Stonecutters shaped laterite blocks to reinforce embankments. Devisers moved along the work sites, ensuring each layer of earth was tamped and leveled. Inscriptions from this period praise Indravarman as a ruler who caused the waters to rest as he willed, an achievement that set the standard for all his successors. Once the Baray filled with monsoon rains, it transformed the landscape. During dry seasons, water flowed into canals, leading to surrounding rice paddies. Farmers could plant multiple crops each year, steadily increasing the empire's wealth. Surpluses allowed Indravarman to fund temple construction, military campaigns, and a sophisticated administration. The prosperity of this first reservoir gave rise to an idea that would define Khmer civilization. Water was the foundation of power. But Indravarman did not stop with the Baray itself. At its southern edge, he commissioned the temple of Preah Ko, dedicated to his ancestors and the Hindu gods. Sacred bull stood at the threshold between land and water. To the king and his subjects, the temple's reflection on the reservoir's surface was not merely beautiful. It was a sign that their realm, too, floated upon sacred waters, blessed by the gods. This blending of utility and symbolism set a pattern that later Khmer rulers would follow. Reservoirs became part of royal self-presentation, and they became a primal fear in chasing the god himself, and so pain that no one came close to the reservoirs for hundreds of years. Each king who succeeded Indravarman felt compelled to build even larger barrays to prove that his command over the land and over cosmic forces surpassed his predecessors. The race for hydraulic supremacy began here, in the shallow basin of the Indra-Tataka. Over time, the knowledge needed to build such reservoirs became institutionalized. Specialized teams of surveyors, engineers, and artisans formed a professional class. They preserved techniques for calculating gradients, constructing dikes, and aligning structures to celestial markers. Even when kings came and went, these techniques endured, evolving through practice and experience. It is easy to imagine Indravarman standing on the embankment as the first rains filled the reservoir. Perhaps he watched the waters rise with satisfaction, knowing that he had not only secured his people's livelihood, but also inscribed his name into the memory of the land itself. The Indra-Tataka was more than a project. It was a promise that the Khmer Empire would master the cycles of nature. Yet the Baray also posed challenges. Silt accumulated over time. Embankments required constant repair. The delicate balance between storage and release had to be maintained every season. If any link in the system failed, entire harvests could be lost. Managing such a reservoir demanded discipline and foresight. The Khmer people rose to the challenge because they knew their future depended upon it. Indravarman's vision inspired not only his own generation, but centuries of kings who followed. The idea that a ruler must build reservoirs as proof of legitimacy became a Khmer tradition. In time, the scale of these constructions would grow almost beyond imagination, but it all began with a single conviction: that water, properly harnessed, could secure eternity. As we leave this chapter, picture the dawn light spreading across the Indra-Tataka, the water still as polished bronze. In that reflection lay the first glimpse of the Khmer Empire's destiny, a destiny built on earth, shaped by faith, and sustained by the patient flow of water. Chapter 3: The East Baray, a Lake of Ambition. By the dawn of the 10th century, the Khmer Empire was ready to move beyond the achievements of Indravarman I. The capital shifted north to Angkor, a place where the land rose gently toward the Kulin Hills and the great Tonle Sap Basin stretched to the south. Here, kings dreamed even larger dreams, and none was more determined to leave a mark than King Yasovarman I. Yasovarman's reign began with a declaration of purpose. He would build a capital worthy of his lineage and surpass his father's legacy. To accomplish this, he chose a new site on the north bank of the Siem Reap River and named it Yasodarapura, the city bearing glory. But a city so ambitious required not just temples or palaces, it needed water. More water than any previous reservoir had ever contained. Thus was born the East Baray, the second monumental reservoir of the Khmer hydraulic age. Its proportions dwarfed everything before it, over 7 kilometers long, nearly 2 kilometers wide, with embankments rising as high as 10 meters. At full capacity, it held enough water to feed tens of thousands of hectares of rice fields. Why attempt such an immense project? Part of the answer was practical. As the Khmer population expanded, so did the demand for food security. The East Baray allowed farmers to grow rice through the dry season and helped prevent famine in years when monsoons failed. But the reservoir also carried deeper meanings. Like the Indra-Tataka before it, the East Baray was designed as a cosmic ocean, its waters encircling an artificial island temple known as the Mebon, the symbolic Mount Meru. To the Khmer mind, no distinction existed between practical utility and sacred purpose. An irrigation basin could also be a mirror of the universe. This duality justified the immense labor invested. By building a reservoir of such scale, Yasovarman was demonstrating not only his care for his people, but also his right to rule, a king who commanded the cycles of heaven and earth. Constructing the East Baray tested the limits of Khmer engineering. Surveyors first had to chart the terrain in detail, identifying natural depressions and subtle slopes. Teams of diggers excavated vast quantities of soil, which were piled up to form the 4 embankments. Laterite and sandstone blocks were laid in key areas to strengthen the walls against erosion. At the heart of the reservoir, workers built the Mebane on an artificial island, accessible only by boat when the Beret was full. Canals radiated out from the embankments like arteries from a beating heart. When the rains came, water flowed into the Beret from surrounding streams. In the dry season, a carefully controlled release kept fields green and yielded multiple harvests each year. For the Khmer people, accustomed to seasonal uncertainty, this steady abundance seemed nothing short of miraculous. When the East Beret finally filled, it must have appeared like a boundless lake shimmering beneath the tropical sun. From the embankments, one could not easily see the far shore. Fishermen cast nets from dugout canoes. Priests journeyed to the Mebane temple to perform rituals that consecrated both the reservoir and the kingship it symbolized. The reflection of clouds on its surface became a reminder that human will could tame the caprices of nature. Over time, the East Beret became more than an engineering marvel. It was a life-sustaining force. The steady supply of water helped the Khmer Empire transition from a largely subsistence economy to a sophisticated system of surplus production and redistribution. Rice surpluses fed artisans, temple builders, and the administrative elite. With reliable harvests, the state could demand taxes, store grain against famine, and fund military campaigns to expand the empire's borders. Yet the Bari also demanded vigilance. Silt carried by incoming water gradually accumulated along the bottom, reducing capacity. Embankments, battered by wind and waves, required constant maintenance. Records suggest that every generation had to recommit to preserving and restoring the structure. This obligation forged a continuity of purpose that stretched across centuries. One king after another renewing the covenant between water and power. Yasovarman's East Beret also inspired imitation. Later kings would build even larger reservoirs, culminating in the West Beret, whose scale remains astonishing even by modern standards. But the East Beret set the precedent. A reservoir not just as an agricultural tool, but as a symbol of royal legitimacy and divine order. Today, the East Beret is mostly dry, its bed crisscrossed by dirt tracks and patches of grass. Yet when monsoon rains return, pools of water gather in the low places, hinting at the reservoir's former grandeur. The Mebane temple still stands on its island, an ancient marker of ambition and devotion. And if you stand there in the quiet afternoon, you can almost imagine the voices of laborers carrying baskets of earth, the splash of oars on water, and the chants of priests consecrating a lake that would feed an empire. The story of the East Beret is a testament to what a civilization can achieve when it dares to think in centuries rather than seasons. It proved that the Khmer people would not merely adapt to their environment, they would transform it into an enduring testament to their vision. Chapter 4. The West Beret, a lake without horizon. By the 11th century, the Khmer Empire had entered an age of extraordinary ambition. Angkor was no longer simply a capital. It was the beating heart of an empire that reached across much of Southeast Asia. Kings measured their greatness not only by the temples they built, but by how fully they could command water. Each generation sought to surpass the last. This drive culminated in a project so vast that it seemed to swallow the horizon itself, the West Beret. The West Beret began under King Suryavarman I, whose reign marked a time of consolidation and expansion. He was determined to establish his authority over rival claimants to the throne and to leave behind an achievement no future king could ignore. To do this, he envisioned a reservoir that would eclipse every prior effort in scale and impact. Even by Khmer standards, the West Beret was unprecedented. Its dimensions alone inspired awe, nearly 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, encompassing an area of more than 16 square kilometers. The embankments rose as high as 14 meters in places, forming an immense earthwork that redefined the landscape. When filled, The West Baray held more than 50 million cubic meters of water, a volume sufficient to irrigate thousands of hectares of farmland for months. Such a reservoir could not be built by one king alone. While Suryavarman I initiated the project, his successors continued the work, refining the embankments, excavating channels, and constructing spillways to regulate flow. Generations of laborers shaped the basin, carrying soil in baskets, cutting laterite blocks for reinforcement, and laying channels with an almost mathematical precision. The purpose of the West Bari was partly agricultural. It provided a dependable water supply that made multiple harvests possible, even in the driest seasons. In an era when drought could devastate entire provinces, this security was transformative. Surplus rice supported armies and artisans, enabling the construction of Angkor Wat and other masterpieces. Yet, as with earlier barays, the West Baray was also a cosmic statement. The rectangular shape mirrored the Hindu conception of the universe, an ocean surrounding a central mountain. At its center, engineers built the Western Mabon, a temple dedicated to Vishnu. When the reservoir filled to its brim, the temple seemed to float in the endless expanse, as if resting at the center of the cosmic sea. This blending of the sacred and the practical was a hallmark of Khmer civilization. Every feature, every canal, embankment, and spillway had both a worldly and a symbolic function. By sustaining agriculture, the king sustained his people. By aligning his reservoir with divine principles, he claimed the gods' favor. The construction process itself was a logistical triumph. Surveyors charted the terrain, marking where embankments would hold back seasonal floods. Laborers dug the basin, often working waist-deep in mud during the rainy season. Supervisors ensured that slopes were consistent and that embankments were compacted to withstand the immense pressure of stored water. Stone sluices were inserted at strategic points to control release into irrigation channels. At the height of its use, the West Baray transformed Angkor into a landscape of engineered abundance. In the dry season, water flowed through canals to paddies, sustaining rice crops when the surrounding countryside was parched. Boats ferried goods across its surface, linking settlements to the capital. Fishermen cast nets into its depths, adding protein to the Khmer diet. At night, the vast mirror of water reflected the stars, a serene counterpart to the grandeur of Angkor's temples. But, like all monumental achievements, the West Baray required constant attention. Silt gradually accumulated on the floor of the reservoir, reducing its capacity. Embankments needed frequent repair after heavy rains. Records indicate that each king undertook projects to dredge channels, reinforce walls, and restore spillways. This ceaseless maintenance bound generations of rulers to the same purpose: to keep the water flowing. Over time, the West Baray became more than an irrigation system. It was a testament to the Khmer belief that human will could harness the forces of nature. Each monsoon that filled its basin reaffirmed that conviction. Each dry season harvest proved that water, disciplined by engineering, could sustain an empire of millions. The scale of the West Baray has few parallels in pre-modern history. Even today, it remains one of the largest hand-dug reservoirs on Earth. Satellite images reveal its massive outline etched into the Cambodian plain. Though centuries have passed since it last operated at full capacity, parts of the Baray still fill during the rainy season. The Western Mabon endures on its island, a quiet witness to the empire's greatest hydraulic triumph. Yet, if the Western Mabon endures on its island, a quiet witness to the empire's greatest hydraulic triumph. Standing on the embankment now, it is hard not to be moved by the ambition that inspired such a work. The Khmer did not build merely for themselves. They built for generations yet unborn, seeking to tame time as surely as they tamed the monsoon. In this lake without horizon, we see the defining spirit of the Khmer Empire, a faith that the cycle of rain and drought could be mastered, that the heavens themselves could be mirrored in a reservoir of human making, and that the power to shape water was the power to shape destiny. Chapter 5. Canals. The arteries of Angkor. Reaching across hundreds of kilometers, Canals threaded through the landscape, linking rivers, reservoirs, moats, and rice paddies in a lattice of control. Some were grand avenues, wide enough for boats to carry grain and stone. Others were modest ditches, directing water to a single hamlet's fields. Altogether, they transformed the natural cycle of rainfall into a managed resource that underpinned both survival and prosperity. The origins of Khmer canal building are ancient. Even before the Great Barrays were dug, early rulers constructed channels to drain floodwaters and irrigate paddies during the dry season. Over generations, these canals grew longer and more sophisticated. As Angkor expanded, so did the ambition of its hydraulic engineers. Canals became straighter, embankments taller, and sluices more complex. By the 11th century, this network had reached a scale rivaling any in the ancient world. Each canal served multiple functions. The largest channels diverted monsoon floods that might otherwise inundate settlements. Others fed water steadily into reservoirs, recharging them throughout the rainy months. Smaller canals branched off to nourish rice fields, ensuring that crops received water in precisely measured quantities. Some carried silt-laden water from the rivers, depositing fertile sediments that refreshed the soil. This constant flow sustained an economy dependent on rice. Fields around Angkor could yield 2 or even 3 harvests a year, an output that supported dense populations and funded the empire's expansion. Surplus rice was stored in granaries, traded across Southeast Asia, or distributed as payment to temple builders and soldiers. Yet, canals were more than conduits for irrigation. They were vital highways of commerce. Flat-timbered boats carried bricks, sandstone blocks, and timber for construction projects. Traders ferried goods to and from Angkor, bringing pottery, iron tools, salt, and woven cloth. The canal's role as transport corridors helped the capital flourish as a nexus of trade and culture. Engineers faced constant challenges in maintaining this labyrinth. Canals silted up as rivers carried sediment downstream. Weeds choked narrower channels. Embankments eroded under heavy rains or collapsed when burrowing animals undermined them. Every year, workers were dispatched to dredge, reinforce, and clear these arteries, ensuring that water could flow where it was needed most. One of the greatest feats of Khmer canal building was the North Canal, an immense channel running from the Kulin Hills toward the East Barre. It supplied fresh water during the monsoon and helped replenish reservoirs through smaller feeder channels. Another marvel was the canal that linked the West Barre to the Tonle Sap, allowing water to flow in and out with the seasons, a delicate balancing act of storage and release. Throughout Angkor, the alignment of canals reflected the Khmer worldview. Channels were often built along cardinal directions, echoing the sacred geometry that informed temple design. Just as berries mirrored the cosmic ocean, canals could be seen as earthly representations of the rivers that flowed around Mount Meru, sustaining all life. During ceremonies, priests and rulers performed rituals along the canal banks, blessing the waters that made their kingdom fertile. In inscriptions, kings described themselves as masters of the waters, a title as important as any military conquest. By commanding the flow of rivers and rain, they asserted their right to rule and their power to maintain cosmic harmony. Archaeologists today trace these canals by studying satellite images and ground surveys. Even after centuries of neglect, many channels remain etched into the Cambodian landscape, dry furrows that once shimmered with water. Some have been repurposed for modern agriculture. Others lie hidden beneath jungle or fields. Their persistence is a testament to the durability of Khmer engineering. Standing beside one of these ancient canals, it is possible to imagine the bustle of life that once thrived along its banks. Farmers tending rice paddies, boats gliding silently past, children playing in the shallows, priests chanting blessings. These waterways were as essential to Angkor's survival as any temple or fortress. In the grand vision of the Khmer Empire, water was never simply a gift of the monsoon. It was a resource to be disciplined, channeled, and transformed into prosperity. The canals were proof that a society could remake its environment to sustain millions, and do so for centuries. As we close this chapter, remember that each stone embankment and quiet channel carried the hopes of a civilization determined to rise above the whims of nature. In the next part of our story, we will explore how the mastery of water became intertwined with the most magnificent achievement of Khmer architecture, the building of Angkor Wat. Chapter 6. Angkor Wat. Water as Sacred Foundation. When most people think of the Khmer Empire, they think first of Angkor Wat, the monumental temple whose towers rise like stone lotus buds against the sky. Yet to understand how this marvel was possible, we must look again to water. The construction and enduring stability of Angkor Wat were inseparable from the hydraulic systems that nourished its foundation and symbolized the universe itself. Angkor Wat was built in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II. His reign was marked by military ambition and a desire to leave a legacy worthy of the gods. The temple was dedicated to Vishnu, diverging from the earlier king's devotion to Shiva. This choice carried both theological and political significance, reflecting a vision of kingship rooted in cosmic order and continuity. From the outset, water was central to the design. The entire complex is surrounded by a massive moat nearly 200 meters wide, forming a perfect rectangle more than 5 kilometers in circumference. This was not merely a defensive ditch, but a symbolic ocean, the primordial waters that encircle Mount Meru. In Hindu cosmology, by encasing his temple in water, Suryavarman proclaimed that Angkor Wat was not of this world. It was the cosmic axis, the center of all creation. Yet the moat was also a practical engineering feature. It stabilized the sandy soil beneath the temple, distributing pressure evenly across the foundations and preventing subsidence. Without this hydraulic design, the immense weight of the sandstone towers could have caused the structure to collapse over time. In this way, sacred symbolism and technical necessity were perfectly fused. The builders of Angkor Wat drew upon generations of hydraulic expertise. Canals diverted water from the Siem Reap River, regulating the moat's level through sluice gates and spillways. During the monsoon, these channels prevented flooding around the temple precinct. In the dry season, they ensured a steady supply to maintain the water table. This balance was critical not only for agriculture, but for the preservation of the temple itself. Inside the moat, causeways led to the temple gates. Visitors would cross these bridges as if leaving the human realm behind, entering a sacred space suspended between earth and heaven. The reflection of the towers on the moat's surface deepened this illusion, creating the impression of a floating temple. Water also shaped life within Angkor Wat. Basins and ponds collected rainwater for ritual purification. Reservoirs provided clean water for residents and pilgrims. The temple's many courtyards were designed with channels to carry away excess rain, protecting foundations from erosion. Every detail reflected a consciousness of water as both threat and blessing, a force to be managed with reverence. Angkor Wat's construction relied on the same canals and barays that fed the surrounding rice fields. Boats transported sandstone blocks, quarried from the Kulin Hills, along waterways engineered generations earlier. The labor force, tens of thousands strong, was supported by surplus rice harvested from fields irrigated by the west and east barays. Without this hydraulic infrastructure, the temple's scale would have been unthinkable. The temple's builders did more than create a monument to Vishnu. They crafted a statement about the Khmer worldview. Inscriptions carved into doorways and pillars describe the king as the protector of the sacred waters and the Lord who maintains the cosmic ocean. These titles were not poetic flourishes. They proclaimed a truth understood by every subject. The Khmer Empire endured because it mastered the cycles of water. As centuries passed, Angkor Wat continued to rely on the same hydraulic systems. Dynasties rose and fell, but the canals and reservoirs sustained the land. Even after the empire's decline, the temple remained occupied by Buddhist monks, who tended its shrines and maintained parts of the surrounding waterworks. When European explorers arrived in the 19th century, they marveled at both the grandeur of the architecture and the ingenuity of the hydraulic engineering that supported it. Today, Angkor Wat is celebrated as the largest religious monument on Earth. Yet its survival owes as much to water management as to artistry. The moat still cradles the temple, and seasonal rains continue to fill the channels designed nearly 900 years ago. Satellite imagery reveals how these ancient waterways once connected the temple to the wider Angkor landscape, an interlocking system whose sophistication scholars are still uncovering. Standing before Angkor Wat at sunrise, when the tower's silhouette against a sky of deepening gold, it is easy to be overwhelmed by its beauty. But beneath that beauty lies a deeper truth. The temple is the culmination of centuries of learning, of how to tame water, store it, and release it in harmony with the seasons. Every stone was set in place with an understanding that without water, even the mightiest vision would fade. The story of Angkor Wat is the story of an empire that refused to be hostage to drought or flood. It is a testament to the conviction that nature's cycles could be transformed into a foundation as enduring as sandstone. As we move to the next chapter, we will see how this same mastery of water became both a source of resilience and, in time, a source of vulnerability. Chapter 7. The Seasons of Abundance. To appreciate why the Khmer Empire built reservoirs the size of cities, one must first understand the cycles of the monsoon. For in Cambodia, the rhythm of the year was not measured by the passage of months, but by the coming and going of the rains. It was this pattern, predictable and yet never fully reliable, that inspired centuries of hydraulic innovation. The wet season began in May or June, when monsoon winds blew moisture-laden air from the Indian Ocean across Southeast Asia. For weeks on end, the skies opened. Rain fell in sheets, flooding rivers, swelling the Tonle Sap Lake, and saturating the fields. In these months, water was abundant, even overwhelming. The land drank its fill and more, and farmers prepared for the planting of rice. As the monsoon progressed, the Mekong River rose so high that it reversed the current of the Tonle Sap River, forcing water back into the lake. This annual reversal was a marvel of nature, transforming Tonle Sap into the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia. Fish spawned in enormous numbers, feeding an entire region. When the waters finally receded in November, they left behind a layer of fertile silt, a gift from the floods. In the dry season, the land turned golden. Rice fields ripened and were harvested, while the sky grew pale and cloudless. For many societies, this would have meant an end to cultivation until the rains returned. But the Khmer had learned to store water, to extend the season of abundance into the months of scarcity. Barrays and canals became the repositories of life itself, enabling a second and sometimes even a third rice crop before the cycle began again. This capacity to grow food year-round made the Khmer Empire one of the most agriculturally productive civilizations of the pre-modern world. Rice was not only a staple of daily life, it was the currency of power. The surplus it generated supported temple building, trade, and military campaigns. It underpinned every dimension of Khmer society. Farmers worked in organized collectives, each responsible for maintaining sections of canal and embankment. Teams dredged silt from channels, patched leaks in the barrays, and ensured that irrigation reached every paddy. This labor was coordinated by an administrative hierarchy that kept detailed records of land, harvests, and water rights. Inscriptions from temple walls describe gifts of rice to monasteries, distributions to workers, and the storage of grain against famine. The abundance made possible by water storage extended far beyond Angkor. Outlying provinces contributed rice as tribute, transported along the canals to royal granaries. In good years, surpluses were traded for luxury goods, textiles from India, ceramics from China, and aromatic woods prized throughout Asia. In times of drought, the same reserves became a lifeline. Yet the Khmer approach to water was never purely utilitarian. Each act of irrigation carried a spiritual dimension. As rice sprouted and ripened, farmers offered prayers to the deities who governed fertility. Water, in their eyes, was a gift from the heavens and the symbol of cosmic order. The Reservoirs were not merely reservoirs, they were sacred lakes reflecting the divine world. In the greatest years of the empire, when the monsoon came as expected and the canals brimmed with water, Angkor was a city of extraordinary vitality. Foreign visitors described a metropolis bustling with markets, palaces, and gilded temples. Rice shipments arrived daily, and processions of boats plied the waterways, carrying everything from construction materials to ceremonial offerings. It was a landscape shaped by human hands but alive with the forces of nature. The seasons of abundance left their mark on every aspect of Khmer culture. Festivals coincided with the cycles of planting and harvest. The New Year, celebrated in April, marked the transition from the dry season to the first rains. Monsoon festivals honored the spirits of water and asked for their blessing. Even warfare was planned around the rains, as armies depended on the movement of rivers and the navigability of canals. Yet this abundance came at a price. The same systems that secured prosperity also demanded constant vigilance. Embankments had to be inspected after each flood. Sluice gates needed regular maintenance. A neglected canal could become clogged with silt in a single season, rendering fields dry and unproductive. In this way, water shaped not only the landscape, but the daily obligations of the people. Archaeological evidence reveals how closely the Khmer measured and responded to the rhythms of the monsoon. Remnants of spillways and channel diversions show that engineers anticipated variations in rainfall, designing redundancies to protect against both drought and flood. Stone inscriptions describe donations of labor and materials to maintain these systems, proof that water management was seen as a sacred duty. Standing today amid the remains of Angkor, with its empty canals and dry barrays, it is easy to forget that for centuries these structures brimmed with life-giving water. The seasons of abundance were not mere happenstance, but the product of deliberate design, a civilization's response to the capricious gifts of the monsoon. The Khmer Empire's mastery of this cycle explains why they dared to build reservoirs the size of cities. In their world, to control water was to hold the key to survival, wealth, and legitimacy. It was the promise of abundance, renewed each year when the rains returned. In the next chapter, we will explore how this delicate balance began to falter, as climatic shifts and human pressures exposed the vulnerabilities hidden beneath centuries of success. Chapter 8. Drought and the cracks beneath the surface. For centuries, the Khmer Empire's vast waterworks sustained its wealth and power. The canals flowed, the barrays brimmed, and the rice harvests fed a population that may have reached 1 million. But every system, no matter how ingenious, has limits. Beneath the surface of this engineered abundance lay vulnerabilities waiting for the right moment to emerge. When they did, the consequences would be profound. Beginning in the 14th century, the climate of Southeast Asia entered a period of instability. Evidence from tree rings and sediment cores shows a pattern of prolonged droughts punctuated by sudden, intense monsoon rains. This combination, years of meager rainfall followed by catastrophic floods, was precisely the scenario the Khmer hydraulic system was least prepared to endure. During the dry years, reservoirs like the West Baray could not be replenished. Canals shrank into muddy trenches, rice yields declined, straining the surplus that had long supported the empire's ambitious projects and large population. As droughts persisted, farmers abandoned peripheral fields, concentrating their efforts near the most reliable water sources. The system that had once unified the kingdom began to fragment. Then came the floods. When the monsoon returned with unusual ferocity, torrents of water coursed down from the Kulin Hills. Channels that had narrowed and clogged in the dry years were overwhelmed. Embankments, weakened by neglect and erosion, failed in places. Sudden breaches sent walls of water surging across the landscape, destroying crops and washing away settlements. These alternating calamities strained not only infrastructure, but society itself. Maintaining the canals and barrages required coordinated labor, directed by a central authority capable of mobilizing thousands. But as agricultural production faltered, so did the resources to sustain that authority. The king's legitimacy, long linked to his ability to ensure abundance, came under question. Inscriptions from the later period of Angkor grow fewer and more terse. The great temples stopped rising, roads and canals fell into disrepair. Foreign emissaries, once welcomed into a city of wealth and pageantry, began to record signs of decline. One Chinese visitor noted that the Khmer court seemed diminished, its ceremonies less splendid than before. Yet it would be a mistake to see this decline as sudden or absolute. Even during these hard years, Khmer engineers struggled to adapt. Excavations show that new channels were dug to divert floodwaters. Embankments were raised in places, and old canals were re-excavated. The Khmer did not abandon their hydraulic system. They tried to repair and modify it in the face of changing climate. But these efforts could not fully overcome the cumulative damage. Silt built up faster than it could be removed. The costs of dredging and rebuilding grew prohibitive. Each year of drought deepened dependence on remaining reservoirs, and each flood brought fresh destruction. Over time, the delicately balanced system that had transformed the landscape into a mosaic of abundance unraveled. The pressures were not only environmental. As the Khmer struggled to sustain agriculture, their neighbors grew stronger. In the west, the emerging Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya pressed against Khmer frontiers. Raids and invasions disrupted trade and diverted resources that might have gone to repair the waterworks. Political rivalries within the Khmer elite compounded the turmoil. Rival claimants to the throne drained treasuries and undermined unity. Archaeological surveys show that outlying settlements were gradually abandoned. People moved closer to the Tonle Sap, where the lake's seasonal floods still offered reliable fertility. The great canals leading to Angkor began to dry and silt over. Once thriving fields turned to scrub and forest. Yet even in decline, the Khmer left traces of their enduring resilience. Portions of the hydraulic network continued to function in diminished form. Farmers adapted by switching to less water-intensive crops and relying more heavily on fishing. Inscriptions from the later 14th and early 15th centuries attest to attempts, sometimes desperate, to maintain ritual offerings and repair key embankments. These efforts reveal a society unwilling to relinquish its identity, even as circumstances grew harsher. By the time the capital shifted permanently southward toward Phnom Penh in the 15th century, Angkor was no longer the vibrant metropolis it had been. The reservoirs still reflected the sky, but their purpose had faded. Canals once alive with boats and harvests lay silent. The very engineering that had once given the empire security and glory had become too vast to sustain. This is the paradox of the Khmer achievement. Their success in taming water created a system so ambitious that it eventually exceeded the capacity of any one generation to maintain when circumstances turned. Drought and flood exposed the hidden weaknesses in structures that had seemed eternal. Today, scientists and historians study this collapse not as a simple failure, but as a cautionary tale, how the same ingenuity that brings prosperity can also plant the seeds of fragility. The Khmer Empire teaches us that mastery over nature demands not only vision and skill, but constant renewal and adaptation. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at the daily life this water system once sustained, the farmers, craftsmen, and laborers whose efforts made the reservoirs and canals more than just monuments of stone and earth. Chapter 9. Lives along the water. To walk through Angkor in its prime was to enter a world shaped at every turn by water. Reservoirs glimmered in the distance, canals traced long straight lines across the landscape, and along these waterways, generations of Khmer people lived and worked, their daily rhythms bound to the same cycles of rain, flood, and harvest that had inspired kings to build reservoirs the size of cities. This world was untrammeled by fear. No shadows overtook it. It burned on fire to be connected. The success of this hydraulic civilization rested on countless hands. Farmers who flooded paddies at just the right moment, laborers who dredged silt from the canals, artisans who carved spillways and lined embankments with stone. Their lives were humble in the records of kings and priests, but without them, Angkor's splendor could never have existed. The farming year began when the first rains softened the parched earth. Families worked together to prepare rice fields, leveling the soil and building small retaining walls to hold irrigation water. Seeds were sown into the mud, and the young plants soon rose in bright green rows. As the monsoon deepened, farmers watched the barays fill, knowing that in dry months the stored water would be their safeguard. When the monsoon ended, canals became the arteries of survival. Sluice gates were opened to release water, flowing steadily into paddies that might otherwise wither in the heat. Farmers measured water depth by sight and touch, adjusting flow to prevent both drought and oversaturation. This delicate balance was learned over lifetimes, passed from parents to children as both skill and tradition. In addition to rice cultivation, life along the water involved fishing. The annual flood of the Tonle Sap brought millions of fish into channels and reservoirs. Fishermen set woven traps and nets, collecting catches that provided protein for families and offerings for temples. Fish were preserved by drying or fermenting, creating supplies that lasted through lean seasons. Craftsmen also depended on water. Potters dug clay from canal banks. Brickmakers shaped wet earth into uniform blocks, drying them in the sun before firing. Carpenters floated timber down canals to construction sites. For every monumental temple rising in Angkor, countless smaller workshops and kilns thrived along the waterways. Trade moved on water as well. Barges carried surplus rice to royal granaries or loaded cargo bound for neighboring regions. Merchants set out from Angkor along canal routes to Tonle Sap and the Mekong, exchanging Khmer goods for ceramics, textiles, and luxury items. In this way, the hydraulic network was both the source of sustenance and the medium of commerce. Religion, too, was inseparable from water. Families built shrines along canals, placing offerings to honor Nagas, serpent spirits, believed to inhabit rivers. Before the planting season, rituals invoked blessings from Vishnu or Shiva to ensure the barays would fill. Even funerary practices reflected this reverence. Ashes of the dead were sometimes scattered in reservoirs or streams, returning life to the great cycle of water. Children grew up beside these channels, learning to fish, swim, and navigate dugout canoes. Their games and chores took place on the embankments and causeways that defined the landscape. Inscriptions describe festivals where processions of boats carried statues of deities across moats and barays, accompanied by music, chanting, and the scent of burning incense drifting across the water. For all its grandeur, Angkor's prosperity depended on simple, repetitive labor. Dredging silt, patching dikes, clearing weeds. These tasks were organized through corvée, a system of state-mandated service. Every household contributed time and effort to maintain the canals that made life possible. This collective labor created a sense of shared destiny and a deep understanding that prosperity could not be taken for granted. Archaeological excavations have unearthed glimpses of ordinary life: pottery fragments, fishing tools, rice husks, beads lost along canal banks. These modest remnants speak to a civilization where the lives of common people were as integral to success as royal decrees. The empire's monumental scale was built upon countless acts of diligence and adaptation. Over time, these communities developed a profound resilience. When drought threatened, they rationed stored water. When floods damaged embankments, they organized repairs. When political upheaval disrupted central authority, local networks often kept essential systems functioning. Indeed, in many places, farmers continued to cultivate rice and maintain canals long after Angkor's decline, a testament to their skill and determination. To stand today on the banks of an ancient Khmer canal is to imagine these lives: the farmer walking barefoot along a narrow embankment at dawn, checking the water level; the fisherman lifting a net heavy with silverfish; the potter scraping clay from the damp shoreline. It is to see a civilization in which water was not an abstract resource, but an intimate daily presence. This, perhaps, is the most enduring legacy of the Khmer water system. It was never merely the domain of kings and priests. It belonged to everyone, whose survival depended on the rhythm of the rains and the reservoirs they had built together. In the next chapter, we will explore the spiritual dimension of this relationship with water, the myths, rituals, and symbols that made the reservoirs not only practical marvels, but sacred spaces woven into the Khmer understanding of the universe. Chapter 10. Sacred Waters and the Cosmic Ocean. For the Khmer, water was never just a necessity for life. It was the medium through which they encountered the divine. To build a reservoir was to imitate the cosmic order itself, to bring heaven's pattern down to earth. This spiritual dimension gave the canals and barrays a resonance that reached far beyond their practical uses. At the heart of this worldview was the concept of Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of the universe. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, Meru was encircled by a vast ocean, its waters lapping against continents and realms inhabited by gods and spirits. Every Khmer temple complex was designed as a microcosm of this sacred geography, and every moat and reservoir became a symbol of the cosmic sea. The barrays were the most visible expressions of this belief. When the East Baray and West Baray filled to their brims, their waters mirrored the sky so perfectly that standing on their banks felt like gazing into infinity. At the center of each reservoir stood a temple on an artificial island, the Mebon, representing Mount Meru rising above the primeval waters. Ritual processions ferried offerings to these island sanctuaries, reinforcing the connection between the king, the divine realm, and the life-giving force of water. In inscriptions, Khmer kings described themselves as universal monarchs, ordained to bring harmony between earth and the heavens. Their ability to capture and distribute water was not only an engineering feat, but proof of their divine mandate. By sustaining abundance through reservoirs and canals, they fulfilled their role as cosmic rulers. Sacred symbolism also infused smaller features of the hydraulic system. One system, spillways were decorated with carvings of nagas, serpents believed to inhabit rivers and guard treasures beneath the water. These mythic beings were both protectors and reminders that water, while essential, could also be dangerous if disrespected. Ritual offerings to nagas and water spirits were common, especially before the monsoon, to ensure the rains would come as blessings rather than calamity. Temples themselves depended on carefully managed water. At Angkor Wat, basins collected rain for ritual purification. At Bantai Srey, channels carried water to sacred pools reflecting intricate carvings of gods and demons. The flow of water through these places was choreographed as precisely as any architectural detail, so that every courtyard and shrine resonated with the symbolism of fertility, renewal, and cosmic balance. Even everyday practices reflected this reverence. Farmers sprinkled water over rice seedlings while reciting prayers. New houses were consecrated with water drawn from sacred ponds. During the Khmer New Year, families poured perfumed water over elders' hands to honor ancestors and ask for blessings in the coming season. In all these acts, water was the bridge between the human and the divine. The rituals performed at the barrays were often grand spectacles. At the start of the monsoon, priests and royal officials gathered on embankments to invoke the deities who governed rain. Musicians played gongs and drums as offerings. Flowers, rice, incense were cast into the water. When the first clouds gathered and thunder rumbled across the plain, it was taken as a sign that the gods had accepted the gifts. These ceremonies were not mere formalities. They reinforced the idea that the empire's prosperity depended on harmony between natural forces and human order. To neglect the rituals was to invite imbalance, a failure as grave as any military defeat. In Khmer inscriptions, droughts and floods were often explained as consequences of spiritual negligence or the decline of righteous rule. This understanding of water as both sacred and practical helped sustain Khmer resilience. When the climate grew harsher in later centuries, the same rituals continued, binding communities together in shared purpose and shared faith. Even as the hydraulic system weakened, the conviction that water was a gift from the gods endured. Modern archaeologists have uncovered offerings buried at the foundations of spillways and canal gates, ceramic vessels, beads, and sometimes animal bones. These remnants remind us that each engineering project began with a spiritual foundation. To dig a canal or raise an embankment was not only to reshape the land but to honor the forces that governed its fertility. Standing today at the edge of a dry baray, it can be hard to picture these ceremonies. Yet when the rains return and pools of water gather across the old basin, the reflection of passing clouds hints at the vision that inspired generations. A reservoir not merely of water, but of cosmic promise. This blend of sacred symbolism and engineering mastery is what made Khmer reservoirs unique among the great hydraulic systems of the ancient world. They were, in every sense, built as earthly oceans. Vast, life-giving, and infused with meaning. In the next chapter, we will trace how the knowledge of building and maintaining these sacred waters spread through Khmer society, shaping generations of engineers and craftsmen who inherited the skills and the faith that water was the empire's true foundation. In the end, the city of Khmer birthed and unburdened the soul of all who sought to make their homes within it, and the world revived itself under the taught with honor of the coast. Chapter 11. The keepers of the waters behind the great embankments and gleaming reservoirs of Angkor stood a class of people whose names rarely appeared in royal inscriptions, but whose knowledge made every harvest and every temple possible. These were the keepers of the waters, engineers, surveyors, skilled laborers, and supervisors who inherited the techniques and traditions that sustained the Khmer Empire's hydraulic heart. The Khmer word for these experts has not survived in all its nuances, but inscriptions refer to masters of the ponds and overseers of the embankments. Their responsibilities were as varied as they were vital. Some specialized in surveying the landscape, marking gradients with astonishing precision so water could flow gently across dozens of kilometers. Others designed spillways that released exactly the right volume during floods. Still others trained teams to dredge silt or repair breaches after the rains. Training began early. Boys whose families belonged to this tradition learned to read water levels and soil conditions by sight. They practiced measuring slopes with cords and weighted plumb lines. As they matured, they were initiated into the secrets of construction: how to pack earth in alternating layers for strength, how to quarry and float laterite blocks, how to set wooden frameworks that would guide the digging of a canal. Supervision was hierarchical. At the top were royal engineers, often attached to the temple foundations and the king's household. They designed the largest barays and oversaw their excavation. Below them were provincial overseers who maintained local reservoirs and coordinated labor from surrounding villages. Each level reported upward, forming an administrative structure as complex as any army. Despite this hierarchy, maintenance was a shared obligation. Every community contributed workers for a period each year, often during the dry season when fields lay fallow. Groups camped along canal banks, digging silt by hand into woven baskets. They repaired leaks in embankments and cleared weeds that could choke the flow. Though such labor was arduous, it was understood as part of one's duty to the kingdom and the gods. The technical sophistication of these projects was extraordinary. Khmer engineers knew that the sheer weight of water in a full reservoir could cause embankments to collapse if they were not shaped correctly. They designed slopes that would distribute pressure evenly. They recognized that allowing water to flow too quickly during the monsoon could scour the canal floor, so they built stone-lined channels at key junctures to slow the current. They even anticipated how silt would accumulate, laying out secondary spillways to flush it downstream. Evidence of their skill survives in the precision of surviving structures. The West Baray's embankments remain remarkably straight after nearly 1,000 years. Channels leading from the Baray still follow gentle gradients that would have ensured an even flow. Excavations have revealed wooden stakes used as markers, still embedded in clay after centuries. These keepers of the waters were also custodians of tradition. Each generation preserved records, often inscribed on palm leaf manuscripts or carved into stone, detailing the dimensions of embankments, the schedules for opening sluice gates, the timing of repairs. Though few of these documents have survived the humid climate, their influence can be traced in the consistency of design across centuries. Ritual knowledge was intertwined with engineering skill. Before beginning repairs or new construction, overseers performed ceremonies to honor the Naga spirits believed to dwell beneath the water. Offerings were buried in the foundations. Ceramic pots filled with rice, beads, and small metal objects. These acts were not mere superstition. They reflected a belief that technical success required spiritual harmony. The Khmer engineers' influence reached beyond Angkor. As Khmer rule expanded into neighboring regions, their expertise traveled with them. Inscriptions in Laos and Thailand record gifts of Khmer artisans to assist in the construction of reservoirs and temples. In this way, the knowledge of managing water spread across mainland Southeast Asia, shaping landscapes far beyond the empire's heartland. Yet, for all their skill, the keepers of the waters could not escape the challenges of time and change. As droughts grew longer and floods more destructive, maintaining the immense system became ever more difficult. Each breach demanded more labor. Each failed harvest left fewer resources to fund repairs. The delicate balance that had held for centuries began to erode. Still, the persistence of these craftspeople leaves a powerful legacy. Even after the capital shifted away from Angkor, local communities continued to use and maintain portions of the reservoirs and canals. Some of these structures remained functional for centuries, adapted to the changing needs of the people who inherited them. Today, archaeologists study these ancient waterworks with a sense of awe. The engineering techniques recorded in temple bas-reliefs and hinted at in old embankments reveal a culture that saw no contradiction between the sacred and the practical. The keepers of the waters stood at that intersection, combining technical mastery with spiritual devotion. Their work is why the Khmer dared to build reservoirs the size of cities. It is also why those reservoirs still endure, silent witnesses to an age when water was the measure of a king's greatness and the shared inheritance of an entire civilization. In the next chapter, we will explore how this hydraulic foundation shaped Khmer culture beyond agriculture and religion, how it influenced art, architecture, and the very identity of the empire. Chapter 12: Reflections in Stone and Spirit. The most visible expression of this ideal was the landscape itself. From above, the canals and barays formed a grid of geometric precision. Angkor was conceived not as a collection of disconnected structures, but as an integrated system, a single, vast mandala linking the human world with the cosmic order. Each reservoir mirrored the sky, while each canal traced deliberate paths across the earth. This harmony between nature and design was central to Khmer architecture. Temples rose beside moats that reflected their towers in still water. Angkor Wat's Great Moat was perhaps the most sublime example, a symbolic ocean encircling the stone mountain of the temple, making it appear to float between earth and heaven. This visual effect was intentional. Khmer builders understood that water could transform stone, multiplying its grandeur through perfect reflection. Water also animated the carved surfaces of Khmer monuments. Bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat depict celestial oceans teeming with fish, lotus blossoms, and churning currents. Scenes of daily life show boats plying canals and farmers tending irrigated rice paddies. At Bante Chamar, entire walls are devoted to naval processions, rows of oared vessels moving in disciplined unison. These carvings were more than decoration. They celebrated the culture's intimate bond with water. The symbolism extended to temple reservoirs themselves. Smaller barays built within temple compounds were designed as sacred ponds where devotees could purify themselves before entering shrines. Their waters were considered potent, imbued with blessings from ritual ceremonies. During festivals, priests scattered flower petals across the surface, an act that evoked the celestial lakes surrounding Mount Meru. Beyond temples, water inspired artistic motifs that found their way into everyday objects. Ceramics were incised with wave patterns. Bronze vessels bore Naga serpents whose coils suggested flowing rivers. Even inscriptions often included poetic descriptions of reservoirs, phrases likening them to the mirrored ocean or the gleaming eye of the land. Water also influenced performance and ritual. Ceremonial boat races were held during the monsoon season, reenacting cosmic battles between gods and demons. Musicians played gongs and drums along canal banks, their rhythms echoing across the water. Dancers performed in temple courtyards beside sacred pools, their gestures mimicking the swaying of lotus stems in the current. In all these arts, water was a metaphor for life's transience and renewal. This aesthetic sensibility extended to city planning. Angkor Thom, the royal city built by Jayavarman VII, was laid out with a moat 4 kilometers long on each side. Its walls rose behind this moat, an image of impregnable serenity. Within, smaller channels distributed water to gardens and ponds that softened the grandeur of palaces with moments of reflection. The city's layout was itself a statement. Here was a place where human design and natural forces coexisted in disciplined harmony. Water even shaped Khmer ideas of kingship. In inscriptions, rulers compared themselves to reservoirs, sources of life and stability for their people. Just as a bare gathered the rains and distributed them across the fields, a just king gathered wealth and virtue, sharing them for the prosperity of the realm. To neglect this duty was to allow stagnation, both literal and moral. This cultural vision persisted even during decline. When the reservoirs began to fail, poets and chroniclers described the loss in terms of broken reflections and clouded waters. The empire's decline was felt as a spiritual and aesthetic rupture. The harmonious relationship between humans, nature, and the divine had been disrupted. Modern visitors to Angkor often remark on the feeling of tranquility that pervades the ruins. Part of this comes from the architecture itself, the slow procession of causeways, the symmetry of towers. But part comes from the remnants of water. Even in the dry season, the moats and pools catch the sky in their surfaces. They remind us that for the Khmer, water was the medium through which the world revealed its deepest order. This fusion of utility and beauty is one of the empire's most enduring legacies. The Khmer did not build reservoirs simply to survive. They built them to embody an ideal of civilization, one in which nourishment, faith, and artistic aspiration were inseparable. In the next chapter, we will examine the role that this hydraulic culture played in connecting the Khmer Empire to the broader world, how the barays and canals underpinned trade networks and diplomatic relationships reaching far beyond the rice fields of Angkor. Chapter 13. Waterways of exchange. At the heart of this system was the Tonle Sap Lake, whose seasonal swelling and retreat created a unique hydrological engine. During the monsoon, the Mekong River pushed water back into the Tonle Sap, expanding its surface area fivefold. When the rains receded, the flow reversed, and the lake drained toward the sea. This predictable pulse turned Tonle Sap into one of the world's most productive inland fisheries and a natural crossroads for trade. Khmer engineers took advantage of this rhythm by building canals that connected Tonle Sap to Angkor's reservoirs and markets. Boats laden with rice, fish, salt, and ceramics moved along these channels in great convoys. Some carried goods destined for regional trade. Others delivered supplies for temple construction or royal festivals. The same waterways that nourished fields also ferried the wealth of the countryside to the capital's storerooms and treasuries. Foreign merchants arrived along these routes, bringing textiles from India, ceramics and metalwork from China, and spices from the Indonesian archipelago. Chinese chronicles record that Khmer ports on the Mekong welcomed envoys and traders alike. From the docks, goods were offloaded onto shallow draft barges and poled upriver, through a network of canals that could transport cargo deep into the interior. This trade supported a remarkable level of prosperity. The surplus rice harvested from irrigated fields paid for imports that enhanced the court's prestige: silks, perfumes, horses, and luxury items reserved for elite consumption. Skilled artisans adapted foreign techniques to local tastes, producing hybrid objects that blended Khmer motifs with imported forms. In this way, hydraulic abundance encouraged cultural exchange as well as material wealth. Diplomatic missions also relied on water transport. Inscriptions describe embassies dispatched to China and Champa, their journeys beginning in the same channels that fed the rice fields. When emissaries returned bearing tribute or imperial edicts, processions of boats carried them upriver to Angkor, where the king would receive them in ceremonies combining political formality and spiritual invocation. Water was the conduit through which the Khmer presented themselves to the world. Religious influences followed these routes. Hindu and Buddhist texts arrived from India and Sri Lanka, carried by monks and traders who traveled the same waterways. Pilgrims journeyed to Angkor Wat and other great temples, their passage sustained by the network of reservoirs and canals that made travel possible in an otherwise dense and seasonally flooded region. Just as water united the empire internally, it connected Khmer civilization to a cosmopolitan sphere of ideas and beliefs. This outward orientation was not without challenges. Control of trade routes required constant vigilance. The same canals that carried goods could also be exploited by rivals. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, conflicts with neighboring states frequently involved attacks on key hydraulic junctions. Disrupting irrigation and transport was an effective way to weaken Khmer authority. Protecting the reservoirs and canals became a strategic priority. In response, Khmer rulers fortified critical embankments and stationed guards at canal choke points. Some inscriptions record grants of land and privileges to communities who agreed to defend these structures. In this way, hydraulic infrastructure was both economic lifeline and military asset, a dual role that underscored its centrality to Khmer power. Even in the later centuries, as the empire's hold on outlying provinces loosened, the waterways remained vital. Local lords continued to levy tolls on passing boats. Small-scale trade persisted, sustained by the same flows that once provisioned the temples of Angkor. Fishermen adapted to shifting political realities, but the hydrological rhythms that governed their livelihoods endured. Today, archaeologists can trace these ancient trade routes in the faint lines of silted canals visible from the air. Excavations along embankments reveal shards of imported ceramics, beads, and metal ornaments, material evidence of Angkor's connections to distant cultures. Each fragment tells a story of exchange made possible by the mastery of water. To stand beside these channels is to sense how the Khmer vision of civilization extended beyond the rice fields and reservoirs. They built a society in which water was not only sustenance but a bridge, linking farmers to kings, villages to temples, and Angkor itself to a wider Asian world. In the next chapter, we will return to the intimate scale of daily life, exploring how the rhythms of water shaped festivals, ceremonies, and the experience of time itself in the Khmer imagination. Chapter 14. The calendar of water in the Khmer world, time flowed like water. The changing levels of rivers, the rhythm of rainfall, and the rise and fall of barays were not merely natural occurrences. They were the markers of days, seasons, and sacred intervals. The Khmer calendar, festivals, and even the pace of daily life were inextricably bound to the hydraulic cycles that governed the empire's prosperity. The year began not on a fixed date, but with the first signs of the monsoon. Dark clouds gathering in the southwest signaled more than rain. They marked renewal. In fields and villages, people began clearing paddies, preparing embankments, and checking canal gates. Priests consulted lunar charts and astrological texts to determine the most auspicious days for planting and offerings. The rains themselves were viewed as divine actors, delivering blessings or judgments depending on the people's conduct. Khmer festivals reflected this watery rhythm. One of the most important was the Bon Om Tuk, the water festival, still celebrated in Cambodia today. It marked the moment in late October or early November when the flow of the Tonle Sap River reversed direction, draining from the swollen lake into the Mekong. The Tonle River reversed direction, draining from the swollen lake into the Mekong. This natural marvel was treated as a cosmic event. In Angkorian times, it signified the end of the rainy season and the beginning of the rice harvest. The festival was not just a time of thanksgiving, it was a moment of royal affirmation. Elaborate boat races were held in ceremonial canals and reservoirs, with teams representing different temples, provinces, or guilds. The king himself might appear, seated in a pavilion on the baree's edge, receiving blessings from priests as the boats passed in procession. These vessels were not only swift and strong, they were richly adorned with naga prows, silk pennons, and gold leaf. Their gliding across the water symbolized harmony, unity, and abundance. Other festivals align with agricultural cycles. The plowing ceremony, held at the start of the rainy season, involved sacred oxen, pulling a ceremonial plow through the earth outside a temple. Attended by royal officials and priests, the ceremony invoked fertility and plentiful rains. As the oxen were offered trays of rice, beans, and water, the animals' choices were interpreted as omens for the coming harvest. Within temple precincts, the passage of time was also marked by water. Ritual purification was central to Buddhist and Hindu practice. Monks bathed daily in sacred pools. Lay people sprinkled holy water on statues and shrines. On lunar observance days, the devout gathered at reservoirs or temple moats to float offerings of flowers and candles, acts of reverence that mirrored the cycle of offering and return found in the natural world. The architectural layout of temples reflected the calendar too. Angkor Wat's central causeway aligns precisely with the equinox sunrise. On those mornings, the sun rises directly above the central tower when viewed from the western entrance, a moment that fused celestial order with the sacred space of the temple. Scholars believe that ceremonies were timed to this solar event, reinforcing the king's role as a stabilizer of cosmic time. In villages, daily life was also attuned to hydraulic rhythms. Morning chores were dictated by the level of water in local canals, whether to draw, divert, or wait. Even cooking fires were lit according to when the household water pot had been filled. Children were taught early to observe signs in clouds and bird calls, as these foretold changes in the rains that would affect planting and irrigation. In this way, the Khmer calendar was less a fixed schedule and more a choreography of observation. Priests and elders watched the skies, tracked the moon, and read the water. Decisions about when to dredge a canal, sow rice, or host a festival were shaped by what nature revealed, and by generations of memory encoded in myth and ritual. This fluid perception of time lent Khmer culture a particular kind of resilience. When a monsoon failed or came late, people adapted by reordering rituals, adjusting planting cycles, and seeking new omens. Time was not rigid, but cyclical, alive, and responsive to the same forces that filled the barees and carried boats across the floodplains. Even the concept of legacy was shaped by water's cycle. Inscriptions often compared a just king's reign to an unbroken stream, or the steady flow of the river. The endurance of a reservoir or temple was seen not in permanence, but in its ability to receive and release, like water itself. The memory of ancestors was carried forward not only through stone, but through annual rituals reenacted at their sacred pools and canals. Today, remnants of these calendars linger. Villagers still watch for dragonflies before the rains. Boat races on the Tonle Sap still honor the reversal of the river, and monks continue to chant by lotus-filled ponds at dawn. These are echoes of a world in which time and water were one and the same. In the final chapter, we will reflect on what this grand hydraulic civilization tells us, not only about the Khmer Empire, but about the enduring human desire to live in balance with the forces that shape our world.